Hello, everyone. To all the CISW members, to our folks and friends from the National Right to Housing Network, as well as the Women's Housing and Homelessness Network, welcome. I'm so excited to spend another hour with all of you. I see a lot of you have already found the chat and the Q&A function as well as the slides. Take a minute, let us know where you're tuning in from, what treaty lands you're tuning in from. We would love to see your names pop up on that virtual chat and Q&A. My name is Alexandra Zanis. I am the Social Policy and Communications Coordinator here at the Canadian Association of Social Workers. CISW is located on unceded and unsurrendered Anishinaabe Algonquin territory. And as always, when we come together to talk about things like the right to housing on stolen land, we have an opportunity to acknowledge that we have a long way to go for justice, especially as social workers. I am thrilled. I'm sad a little bit, but I'm heartwarmed to be here today on my final webinar. I am leaving CISW for a new opportunity, and I am so grateful to have an opportunity to have this be my final webinar. For folks who have tuned into a lot of our webinars here at CISW, maybe my face is familiar. I hope you stay in touch. I hope you connect with me in all the different ways so that we can continue to strengthen and promote the profession of social work in Canada. With all that being said, though, I'm still just so excited to be here today with two of my total heroes in this sector. So before I introduce Caitlin and Alex, which I cannot wait to do, I just want to do a couple really brief housekeeping notes. So for folks who are looking for that certificate of attendance, that will be emailed to you about an hour after the presentation has concluded. Feel free to log on anytime, though, to the platform directly and download it from that course completion tracker. Sorry, all. I have a couple little... I'm just going to mute my teams here because it seems like everyone is wanting to chat with me today. With all that being said, though, your certificate of attendance will be emailed to you from that course completion tracker. The handout widget is where you can find some of the incredible publications that both Caitlin and Alex and the teams at both organizations have come up with. I would highly recommend clicking that handout widget. You can also find the slide presentation from today and the first webinar we hosted, which was the Right to Housing in Action. That's all in your handout widget. So take a minute and check out those blue and white icons at the bottom of your screen. I am going to pop open that speaker bio widget because it's my honor and privilege to introduce Caitlin Schwan and Alex Nelson. So Dr. Caitlin Schwan is the National Director of the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network and a senior researcher at the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness. She teaches social policy at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Social Work, where she's appointed assistant professor, status only. She's the former senior researcher for the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Adequate Housing and director of research for The Shift. Dr. Schwan's research focuses on homelessness prevention and human rights, particularly for women and youth. She uses research to build bridges between evidence, advocacy, policy, and lived expertise to advance housing justice. You can also get in touch with Caitlin at their email right at the bottom of that speaker bio. As well, we're joined by Alex Nelson. Alex, I'm so happy to be able to finally do a webinar with you. Alex Nelson is the Community Outreach Coordinator for the National Right to Housing Network and a PhD candidate in anthropology at Western University. Alex's research explores gender, homelessness, disability, and housing policy, specifically focusing on the ways in which gender diverse people with lived experience of homelessness mobilize their experiences to reform policy. Alex's academic research and community involvement is deeply informed by their lived experience of homelessness and involvement in the child welfare system, as well as their experiences at the intersection of queerness and disability. As an advocate, Alex works to advance the role of people with lived experience and in realizing the right to housing. So please feel free to open those speaker bio widgets, read a little bit more about our wonderful speakers. I am so excited to pass it on. If you need me, I'll be in the back end. Feel free to use that chat for general comments about the presentation, that Q&A for dedicated questions for our question and answer period, which we'll have towards the end of this presentation. So feel free to type them throughout the presentation. You don't have to wait till the end. I'll compile them, and then we'll have a formal Q&A towards the end. So Caitlin, Alex, Caitlin, take it away. I am so happy you guys are here today.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. You are just such a champion in terms of introducing us. Feels very good on the ego. So thank you so much for having us. We are so thrilled to be here to talk with you folks about what the right to housing means and looks like in Canada for women and for gender diverse folks. We're at an incredibly important moment in Canada where we have a legislated right to housing for the first time. So we're really going to be thinking about, okay, what are the gendered housing challenges that we're looking at in Canada? How does the right to housing in legislation help us address that, and kind of where we go from here? So as Alex mentioned, my name's Caitlin Schwan. I lead the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm calling in from the traditional and unceded territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe, and the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation, colonially known as Guelph, Ontario. And just a quick plug on the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network. Check out our website at womenshomelessness.ca. A really, really powerful group of women and gender diverse folks who are trying to build a feminist housing movement across Canada, trying to prevent and end homelessness for folks at the intersection of gender and other marginalized identities. And I'll throw it over to you, Alex, if you want to introduce yourself and the network you're coming from.
Yeah, thank you so much, Caitlin. And yes, thank you, Alexandra, for the warm introduction. My name is Alex Nelson. My pronouns are they, them, and I am joining today from the ancestral territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape-Wauk, and Chinooka nations inland, colonially known as London, Ontario. And so in 2019, Canada legally committed to the human right to housing in its National Housing Strategy Act. The National Right to Housing Network, where I'm a representative of today, is a group of over 350 key leaders, organizations, subject matter experts, and people with lived experience of housing precarity and homelessness, all with a shared mission to fully realize the right to housing for all, and ultimately to eliminate homelessness in Canada. You can find us at housingrights.ca, where we have a ton of resources and publications that can help you work through the right to housing, your own understanding of it, and what it means for your practice. And so today I'll be talking about the right to housing, giving you a little bit of an introduction, and then talking about some key introductions when it comes to the right to housing and violations of that right. I'm so happy to be here and to talk with you all. Thank you so much for having me. And I'll pass it back to Caitlin.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay, so this is what we have planned for you today. We're going to get into looking at housing challenges, the intersectional dimensions there, and then into the rights-based stuff. Where are the rights violations for women and gender diverse folks in the area of housing? I'm going to do a really special spotlight on disability and its intersection with gender, and then talk about some policy solutions. And to get us started, I thought it would be helpful to give you folks kind of like a high level analysis and national portrait of what the housing challenges are that women and gender diverse folks are facing. So I think sometimes we think about housing in a pretty gender neutral way, or we think about housing need and homelessness sometimes in a really stereotypical way. So you might think of, for example, in popular culture, there's a lot of representations of older men who are experiencing kind of street homelessness on the street. But what we want to talk about today is the ways in which the picture of homelessness is much larger than that. It's much more diverse. It's intersectionally experienced, and gender is a huge structuring force for what homelessness looks like, and also for how we think about the right to housing. So I'm going to start with some kind of key statistics to give you folks a sense of why are we saying that housing and housing need is gendered. So what you see there on your graph, on your slide, is an infographic that really demonstrates that when it comes to core housing need, what we know is across Canada, women are disproportionately in core housing need and in deeper forms of core housing need. So 65% of folks, or 35% of folks, are living in below, of women are living in below standard housing. compared to 25% of men. And 17% of women-led houses are actually in core housing need compared to 10% of men. And we know this is particularly high for Indigenous women and two-spirited folks, for racialized folks. So when we're talking about, we're talking about housing, it's a huge issue right now. It's a huge focus of the federal budget. We're also really talking about equity on the basis of gender. This is also deeply linked to what we call the feminization of poverty. The kind of disparities we're seeing in housing are reflected in the poverty space as well. So women are much more likely to be in low-paying jobs, to be in precarious work, to be out of the workforce, including because they have greater care burdens, but also to experience intersectional forms of discrimination or exclusion in the workplace. And that's like very historical. And so there's been tremendous progress in this area, as all of you will know, for decades, in part because of huge social movement work. But we still across Canada see really distressing levels of poverty amongst women, and certainly amongst women-led households and single moms. And in the context of COVID, we've really seen enormous levels of eviction for women-led households. In the United States, Black single moms are the group that are experiencing evictions the highest. We don't have that kind of data in Canada right now, but I suspect we're probably looking at similar data here. So all of the depth of that kind of poverty creates the conditions for core housing need and for homelessness. And then so when women or gender diverse folks do end up actually losing their housing or becoming dehoused, because this is a structural process, they end up seeking shelter in the violence against women sector or in the homelessness sector. But unfortunately, once they get there, they encounter a system that is enormously overwhelmed and underfunded. So I have some statistics up there from various years. Today, the occupancy rates in Toronto's women's shelters are at 99%. Some shelters are above 100%. And what that means is we have shelters that are having women sleep on floors, sleep in hallways, sleep in chairs in hallways, because this is a system that is tremendously underfunded and overburdened. And there was a great study done a few years ago by Statistics Canada that looked at, okay, on a single day, how many women and children are showing up at violence against women shelters and being turned away. And the number is enormous. It's almost 1,000 women and children we're turning away each day. You show up at the door of a shelter, you've left an abusive or violent situation, or a situation that in other ways is inadequate. And we're turning away many, many women and gender diverse folks. And this is an absolute crisis. Oh, sorry, just trying to get the slide going there. Sorry, give me a second. There we go. Okay, great. Another big component of this is kind of the disproportionate levels of violence and sexual violence that women and gender diverse folks are experiencing. This data is from a national youth survey across Canada, the largest one we've done in Canada, and it's called Without a Home. And as you can see in the last year, there's huge rates. Like if we ask a young person who identifies as a woman or as trans or as gender diverse, have you experienced a sexual assault in the last year? Those numbers are really high for trans and gender diverse folks. It's almost half of those folks have experienced that kind of violation. And so, I mean, there's many takeaways from this, including that any amount of time on the streets for women, trans, gender diverse folks is really enormously dangerous. And so we really need to be moving upstream. I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of delays. There we go. The other thing I wanted to mention that's very critical to understanding gendered homelessness is that Women and gender diverse folks are much more likely to be in situations of what we call hidden homelessness. So they're more likely to be relying on friends and family, couch surfing, basically remaining in scenarios where they're not directly on the street, including because of the violence that I just mentioned. So what you see there, if you look at this graph, is women are in purple and men are in the dark blue. And you see kind of the overrepresentation of men in all of these systems. And so what this means is not that women and gender diverse folks aren't experiencing homelessness, but they're not actually touching the systems that engage folks who are experiencing street level homelessness. And so this is an infographic we developed to kind of try to demonstrate this. What you see in the center is someone who's experiencing street homelessness, someone you might see kind of directly on your commute in your community. And what we're trying to emphasize is that there are all these other kinds of scenarios that constitute homelessness that women and gender diverse folks are more likely to find themselves in. So whether that's living in overcrowded housing, whether that's engaging in survival sex, trading sex for housing, couch surfing, all of these are violations of the right to housing, are not adequate housing, and constitute homelessness. The last point I want to make is, across all of this, it's really important that we understand there are huge public system failures here. And so multiple public systems like criminal justice, like child welfare, like healthcare can combine to create pathways into homelessness and to deepen housing marginalization for women and gender diverse folks. Probably, one of the most evident examples of this is the child welfare system. For women who do have their children apprehended due to poverty, for example, that is a huge precipitator to homelessness. And we also know once folks enter the child welfare system, they are actually 193 times more likely to become homeless. So there's a pipeline from child welfare into homelessness, and child welfare involvement contributes to homelessness for women and gender diverse folks who have children apprehended. So you have this kind of cyclical intergenerational issue. And as a result, you have a quote like this one, which is really demonstrates this kind of structural issue from a woman in the Yukon who says, "My son is under social services. His social worker is the same social worker I had as a kid." So we're seeing a huge intergenerational intersection between housing and public system failures, and social workers play a really critical role at this juncture, and it's something that's very critical for us to think about. And with that, I'll pass it to you, Alex, to kind of demonstrate some of the intersectionalities there. Oh, I forgot this one. That's okay. We'll go to you, Alex.
Okay, awesome. When we say that homelessness is gendered, we are also referring to the norms, customs, and practices that come to shape the systems and structures that frame homelessness. These systems are set up to respond to experiences in a way that slots into existing assumptions about gender so often. As Caitlin highlighted, homelessness systems are often set up in a way that appears on its surface to be gender neutral. But we know that without specific attention to the needs of women and gender diverse people, gender neutral actually ends up being more like gender limited or even gender violent. This is certainly true for cisgender women, for whom a system set up to disproportionately center the needs of white cisgender men holds serious limitations, but it is also highly exclusive of people whose experiences fall outside of other normative categories. So existing research indicates that homelessness services are designed for normative service users, white, cisgender, able, sane settlers. And I want to mention here the definition of Indigenous homelessness by Métis scholar Jessie Thistle. Colonization of Indigenous bodies, minds, and lands has had the historic and contemporary effect of traumatizing generations of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit by disrupting traditional and vital domestic and territorial systems of governance and obliterating timeless institutions responsible for the socialization of Indigenous peoples. Now, this leads to deep inadequacies in housing conditions, particularly severe for Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit peoples, which is part of the legacy of colonial injury faced by Indigenous communities. There's a dire lack of gender-sensitive, accessible, and culturally adequate services across the homelessness sector. Indigenous peoples face poorer housing outcomes and situations across the board. Due to deep colonial legacies, Indigenous women are vastly overrepresented in homelessness, are more likely to use shelters, and are more likely to experience hidden homelessness than non-Indigenous counterparts. The system is also notable for its deep physical inaccessibility. A Dawn Canada study reports that only 75% of homeless shelters have a wheelchair-accessible entrance, 66% provide wheelchair-accessible rooms and bathrooms, 17% provide sign language, and 5% offer Braille reading materials. In addition, the homelessness sector is also highly exclusive of folks whose experiences fall outside of normative categories of gender identity and expression. Systems often uphold a rigid gender binary, resulting in discriminatory and exclusive practices towards 2S LGBTQ+ persons across the spectrum of housing, in which limited options and deep unaffordability of safe and affirming housing puts queer people more directly in situations of violence, abuse, and exploitation, like Caitlin mentioned. There's a lack of services and supports for gender nonconforming and 2S LGBTQ+ peoples within both the VAW and homeless services, with a national survey indicating that only 53% of VAW shelters provide supports for gender nonconforming peoples. Emergency shelters are particularly noteworthy, as for many people, they represent the choice made only through having no other option. Scholar Alex Abramovich refers to the culture within the emergency shelter system as an atmosphere of normalized oppression. While there is a lack of services for cisgender women, there are even fewer options that are safe, affirming, and accessible for 2S LGBTQ+ women and gender diverse people. In the utter absence of resources specifically tailored to 2S LGBTQ+ people, I want to leave you with a few tips that can reduce the harm faced by gender diverse persons in navigating this system. And now these might seem basic, but these small practices can go a long way in saving lives. They push back just a little bit against the tidal wave of dehumanization gender diverse people experience every day. So those tips are: use gender inclusive language, and don't assume anyone's gender or pronouns based on the way they look. Follow 2S LGBTQ+ people on social media to familiarize yourself with queer people, vocabularies, and lived experiences. Offer your own pronouns in research and service settings, and listen to the language and terms others use to describe themselves. Practice using gender pronouns you're unfamiliar with. Avoid language that assumes gender, so guys, ladies, sir, ma'am, Mr., miss. If you are uncertain of someone's pronouns, use their name in place of gendered pronouns, i.e., Alex is at the store and will stop by the pharmacy to pick up Alex's medication. Familiarize yourself with local resources that are 2S LGBTQ+ inclusive. And finally, support your colleagues to be accountable for gender inclusive practices. Part of shifting practice and policy to be more inclusive and responsive to the needs of women and gender diverse people is understanding how to engage with gendered lived realities. And so in the next section, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the right to housing in Canada as a legal pathway to address the systemic rights violations faced by women and gender diverse people. We focused on this quite a bit during the last webinar, so I won't go too much into detail on the right to housing legislation today, but know you can access it in the previous presentation we did. So, claiming the right to housing. The right to housing is not just a rallying cry. Like human rights more generally, It offers concrete standards that can be implemented and measured for progress. To have the right to housing means to examine and change all of the ways housing fails to meet the needs of those impacted, addressing inaccessibility, cultural inappropriateness, unaffordability. The right to housing actually gives us a concrete legal framework, which has undergone decades of international and domestic advocacy to get to where we are today. And where we are today is that we have the 2019 National Housing Strategy Act, which is the legislative framework that brings the 2017 National Housing Strategy into action. This act finally gives us some domestic accountability mechanisms to make the right to housing real in Canada. The NHSA is powerful legislation because it reaffirms the right to adequate housing as a fundamental human right, as recognized in international law, which offers us rights-based accountability and oversight bodies and mechanisms, some of which are listed here, that keep the minister accountable so that we can actually achieve housing justice. Human rights, like the right to adequate housing, are transformational. The right to housing combines existing negative obligations, like the removal of discrimination, the elimination of barriers to accessibility, with positive obligations, progressive realization, changing systems and structures, advancing rights-based intersectional policies. Some key components of rights-based policy are access to justice mechanisms, including pathways for the robust and ongoing engagement of rights claimants or people with lived experience, using the maximum of available resources, and making sure funds and programs specifically target marginalized and equity-deserving communities. The challenge in Canada is to change a housing system that gives rise to inequality and homelessness into one which ensures the right to adequate housing for all. Human rights claims identify systems, structures, and barriers that obstruct the realization of the right to housing and identify effective remedies. Human rights, like the right to housing, are practical and build effective solutions. They help us map how we get to where we want to go. A quote from the UN Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights: "Systemic violations have broad causes and effects, often arising from the ways in which society is organized, politically, socially, and economically. It is often difficult to identify individual perpetrators who bear individual responsibility for systemic violations. The state as a whole will be responsible." So I want to leave you with some examples of systemic rights violations that you may see within your practice. So the first is evictions, especially those into homelessness, access to justice, inadequate rent protections, and evictions due to a third party's actions. Inadequate housing for women and girls in Indigenous, northern, rural, and remote communities. Ableism and inaccessible housing for women and gender diverse persons with disabilities. We'll go into that a little bit more later. Inadequate housing across the spectrum for women, girls, and gender diverse persons, a lack of gender-specific social housing, the financialization of housing, and major rights-based gaps in Canada's 2017 National Housing Strategy, which holds all of our housing policies and programs, but actually reduces targeted funding for households in core housing need, which disproportionately impacts women-led families. It is helpful to begin thinking about the people you work with on a day-to-day basis as people who hold rights claimants who are being denied those rights. Also beginning to fortify your understanding of the systemic nature of housing inequities so you can be part of the process of enabling communities to claim their rights. And so with that, I'll pass it to Caitlin.
Great. Thank you so much, Alex. So brilliant. I want to spend a few minutes talking about what are we talking about when we say there are gendered violations of the right to housing in Canada. What we know is that we have the right to housing legislated now. This is a huge deal, as Alex mentioned. And it doesn't mean that the government is required to give everyone in Canada a home, but it does mean that government investments have to progressively move towards ensuring that everyone has access to adequate housing. And so when we're talking about adequate housing, we're talking about these 7 dimensions that you see on your screen there. and Alex mentioned these as well. These are all interconnected, and what we see across Canada is different kinds of violations in each of these areas as it relates to gender. So I want to give you a highlight of a few that we're seeing across the country in this area. The first one is that there is really serious gender inequities when it comes to how we fund homelessness services. So across the homelessness sector, if you look at beds, 68% of beds go to men or are co-ed, compared to 13% of beds dedicated to women identifying folks. So there's many women and gender diverse folks who are not going to go to a co-ed shelter because of experiences of violence or harassment within them. So we have a system that is kind of disproportionately linked to the visibility of men's homelessness and is much less responsive to the more hidden forms of homelessness that we know women and gender diverse folks are experiencing. But in general, we still have tons of women and gender diverse folks showing up at shelters and just being turned away. And the consequences of this are really severe. I just quickly want to highlight a few things that we heard from people across the country when we asked them, what happened when you were turned away from a shelter? And here's what folks had to say. They said, slept outside or slept with a man for a place, stayed awake all night looking for a friend to take me in usually. I slept outside, and when I did, the police arrested me and stole my personal belongings. Begged a friend to let me stay with him. In exchange, I cleaned his apartment. I stayed in an abusive situation with my dog and my kid. So these are all serious human rights violations, both in the area of housing, but also right to life, right to health. And so we need to be urgently addressing them now that we have this legislation as a tool to do so. The second human rights violation that we're seeing is that federal investments, so we have a national housing strategy, we're 5 years into it, and what we're seeing is that many of our federal investments actually aren't meeting women and gender diverse folks who are in greatest core need, both in terms of housing and poverty. So we did a national survey with 500 women and gender diverse folks, and we asked them, okay, tell us about your most recent housing. What was that like? What was your income? And what we found is that many folks did not have any money for anything after they paid for housing. Only 14% could afford basic necessities. And so on average, folks were trying to make ends meet through three different means, whether that was social assistance and working under the table and doing part-time work, or a range of strategies to try to make enough to live on. And a third are accumulating debt each month because they're relying on credit cards or predatory loans to try to just survive. So this is the portrait of the kind of depth of poverty that we're looking at for women and gender diverse folks. And then compare this on the right to these two big programs that we have in the National Housing Strategy. So for example, if we look at the Rental Construction Financing Initiative, the criteria there is that only, I believe, 10% or 30% of units needs to be affordable, and affordable is defined as 30% of median total income for families in the area. So what that means is we're defining affordable housing based on what the average rent is in the community, rather than it being income based on what folks can pay. And we certainly know that if you are a single mom on social assistance, your ability to pay for your rent is not determined by whether your neighbors can pay their rent or what their rent is. It's determined by your income. So all of these programs, all of these women on the left, the folks who are involved in our survey, they would not be able to benefit from these programs. And these are folks who are in deep core housing need. And as Alex mentioned, under the right to housing, we have to prioritize those who are in the deepest forms of housing need, and we're really not doing that right now. The third violation I wanted to highlight is that, in a lot of policy, there's been a major focus on chronic homelessness. So folks who are experiencing homelessness for 6 months or more, as documented within homelessness systems. But as we know, women and gender diverse folks are in these more hidden forms of homelessness, maybe trapped in abusive situation. So there's women who were part of our survey that said, I've been trapped in an abusive situation for a decade. I can't get out, and I can't get on a priority list for housing because I don't count as having experienced chronic homelessness. So what we're seeing there is the lack of a gendered analysis of what homelessness looks like flowing into how we define chronic homelessness and resulting in women and gender diverse folks being unable to get priority in some areas of housing policy. And the last piece I wanted to emphasize is really, really interesting. In our survey, we asked folks, why did you lose your most recent housing? And they had many options to choose. Like, it was an extremely long list of reasons. They could choose multiple reasons. Was it healthcare? Was it was no longer affordable? Was there conflict with your landlord? Was the place no longer habitable? A range of stuff. But the top reason was actually a breakup. And this is an incredibly important finding, incredibly gendered finding. The reason that women and gender diverse folks, the top reason they lost their most recent housing is because they were unable or unwilling to remain in a romantic or sexual relationship with another person. So we have a huge population whose security of tenure depends on remaining in these personal relationships. And this is a severe violation of the right to housing. And we really want to ask ourselves, what would eviction prevention look like in this context? And what would it mean to advance security of tenure for women and gender diverse folks? Because it is very unique, and it is kind of an invisible, there's a kind of a constant form of invisible eviction that's happening across the country that we're not tackling in housing policy right now. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Alex.
Thanks so much, Caitlin. That was really helpful context, and you always say it so beautifully. So I'm going to be talking with you about disability specifically. So just a quick note on language. I will primarily be using person-first language throughout this section, persons or people with disability. Language about disability shifts to meet the needs of individuals and communities. So with that, disability poverty is the result of systemic and structural failures. So this is evidenced by the fact that it is also deeply gendered. More than half of those with disabilities living in poverty are women, and a high percentage of those individuals are also racialized. To illustrate this, I want to share some findings from the Women's Network Pan-Canadian Survey. So one of the most startling findings was that 79% of respondents identified living with disability, and on average reported 3 or more disabilities. For a long time, the widely cited statistics suggested that 45% of those experiencing homelessness lived with disability. So in reality, this is actually much higher. These survey results change the frame through which homelessness should be understood. So the most common reason cited for most recent experiences of homelessness was the breakup of a romantic relationship, as Caitlin mentioned. And so 1/3 of respondents also engaged in 3 or more subsistence strategies each month to stay housed. And this means that homelessness for women, girls, and gender diverse people is both relational, so highly dependent on other people, and that fighting to stay housed takes up significant capacity. As one of our brilliant colleagues said once, poignantly, being homeless is a full-time job. So disability and the world that people with disabilities move through is often constructed through non-disabled worldviews, perspectives, and frameworks, without our input and without our lived experiences. Those perspectives are not all the same because we are not a monolithic group. It is vital to pay particular attention to the ways disability is experienced intersectionally. Identity and social location compound experiences of oppression, violence, discrimination, and stigma within homelessness. But by the same token, these systems also work to marginalize and invisibilize some experiences and lived realities. Another way to say this is that a lived reality of disability is informed and mediated by the social, political, economic context within which it is experienced. It is estimated that 22% of people in Canada live with disability, and it's important to reflect on why someone might not be counted in that 22%. Which is compounded by gendered and racialized inequities in accessing diagnoses and navigating the system that renders disability legible in policy and programs. Canadians with disabilities face some of the most dire social and economic circumstances, including facing double or more the rates of poverty and core housing need, meaning housing with affordability, adequacy, or quality concerns. These issues do not fall evenly across all disability experiences. For example, people with mental health or intellectual and developmental disabilities are more likely than others to experience core housing need. People with disabilities also face high rates of incarceration, homelessness, and other forms of institutionalization. So why talk about housing in talking about homelessness? Homelessness for people with disabilities often takes place within a house. To quote from a 2016 StatsCan report on hidden homelessness, Canadians with a disability were more likely to have experienced hidden homelessness. More particularly, those who reported at least 3 disabilities were 4 times more likely to have experienced hidden homelessness, 26%, than those with no reported disability, 6%. Hidden homelessness, as Caitlin mentioned, means exhausting your informal networks before turning to formal services and programs. So couch surfing, staying with friends and family, living in overcrowded or unsafe housing, living with a violent person, or staying in a bad relationship for housing security. There are good reasons why women, but also trans and non-binary people with disabilities, avoid formal institutions and homeless services. The threat of discrimination, valid fears for personal safety and well-being, the dire lack of accessibility in formal services, but also the potential for involuntary and unnecessary institutionalization. Hidden homelessness is characterized by deep housing inadequacies, lack of choice, and lack of security of tenure. These choices are particularly constrained for persons with disabilities, who often have to choose between affordability, accessibility, proximity to life-saving services, and remaining in one's chosen community. And this is not a real choice. So what does this ableist and gendered inequity look like in action? In Toronto, 90% of threats of illegal act eviction due to a third party's actions are delivered to women. Women face a higher likelihood of evictions into homelessness, heightened by a lack of enforcement in delivering corresponding supports. These findings are even more strongly linked for racialized women and women with disabilities. And from the Women's Network survey, the odds of being evicted were more than 3 times greater if participants had a mental health disability or reported a substance use problem. These circumstances represent a systemic violation of the right to housing, largely stemming from housing inadequacy. So next, lived experience-led advocacy. The backdrop of the conversation I want to have with you about lived experience and meaningful engagement is that I know many of you engage with people who have lived experience of homelessness in various ways throughout your work. So how do we move forward? How do we advance justice? How do we collectively work to solve these massive accessibility and adequacy barriers? One key way is through robust engagement and leadership by people with lived experience. Nothing about us without us is the slogan of the disability rights movement. This phrase was successfully mobilized by early disability activists in social and political contexts to contest the influence of ableist and exploitative systems, institutions, and structures on the lives and voices of people with disabilities. It foregrounds instead the agentic and active capacity of people with disabilities to advocate for themselves. Interestingly, this language and politics of the disability rights movement are directly taken up within end homelessness movements. The work being done by people with lived experience of homelessness should be understood within the context of disability self-advocacy, from the widespread uptake of Nothing About Us Without Us as a central rallying cry, the shift towards person-first language, to the way lived experts of homelessness frame the need for their inclusion. This highlights the potential for powerful cross-movement solidarity. Recently, in policy and advocacy spaces, language has been shifting towards nothing without us, signaling a frustration with the way that disability advocacy is often siloed within conversations just about disability. Instead, disability should be a core element within all discussions on advancing inclusive and effective models for social change. Speaking as both a disabled person and a lived expert of homelessness, we need to be part of envisioning a future, or else the future imagined by others will leave us behind. A core pillar of rights-based policy frameworks is the participation of rights claimant communities under the National Housing Strategy Act, sometimes referred to as dialogic, referring to the bidirectional, fully participatory nature of the conversation. We need to enable that participation through meaningful engagement. But what does meaningful engagement really mean? In well-intended efforts to conduct good work, researchers and policymakers can find themselves unintentionally perpetuating and reinforcing hegemonic systems of power and oppression. Spaces of engagement are vital, but often the terms of the conversation are set before people with lived experience even join. So it's vital that we rethink the powerful assumptions that tend to structure lived experience work. One advocate I know put it best: it feels like decision makers are at the table, but their backs are turned. They will have the adult conversation once we leave the room. When you invite people to engage with you because of who they are, you have to ask yourself, who wields power over the narrative produced and the rewards that come with it? The question of engaging with lived experience or disability and homelessness ultimately is a question of voice and epistemic authority. What is this space of engagement making possible in the world, and for whom does it continue to be inaccessible? We are still in the process of dismantling barriers to full, equitable participation within the lived experience movement and in broader society. So, in summary, for this section, disability poverty is gendered, and it leads to disproportionate homelessness for women, girls, and gender-diverse peoples with disabilities. This homelessness is invisibilized. Rights-based governance identifies and prioritizes those in most extreme or vulnerable circumstances, and access to justice starts by engaging people from those communities, particularly people with lived experience. And finally, NHS capital initiatives are not alleviating core housing need, which directly impacts people with disabilities. In a workshop held by the NRHN on International Human Rights Day in 2020, panelist Victoria Levac, a claimant in a major systemic case before the Nova Scotia Court of Appeal on the right to supported housing for disabilities, was asked what her claim meant to her. And so she said, "It's about dignity. I don't think my government looks at me as a human being. I think they look at me as a problem, as something to be fixed. And that's not the case. I just want my humanity, please. And I want a home." So it's vital that we start these projects in collaboration, deep collaboration with people with lived experience, and that we work to address the gaps in data and funding that leave affordable, secure housing so far out of reach. Thank you. I'll pass it to Caitlin.
Oh, I just love hearing you speak, Alex. I'm always left speechless, frankly, and so honored to learn from you and work alongside you. I I want to leave us time for a brief discussion, but quickly, we wanted to throw some ideas at you in terms of where we go from here. There are a range of policy solutions and proposals that both of our networks have put forward in our publications. So please check those out, because this is just some high-level thoughts. But what you've heard from us across this presentation is a real need for housing investments that address folks who are experiencing the deepest core housing need, and we know those are women and gender diverse folks. And we need to be thinking about that intersectionally, so centering racialized folks, Black folks, Indigenous folks, women and gender diverse folks with disabilities. All of those intersections need to be at play when we talk about resource allocation. And again, looking at the unique needs of these populations. As Alex, explained so beautifully, there's such profound gaps in our provision of accessible housing and emergency services. It really is a tremendous shame in our country, and we should be deeply ashamed of it. Third, I want to propose that, we've seen federal government commitments around home ownership and for largely middle class and up folks. What we really need is pathways to home ownership and security of tenure for folks who are low income, folks who have disabilities, and folks who are marginalized socioeconomically. And that can look like a lot of things. We can look around the world for really interesting models in that regard. And similarly, we need to stop dehousing people. And that means thinking about eviction prevention from a gendered lens. If we are evicting, we have mass evictions of women and gender diverse folks because they won't remain in a relationship, that's a problem. We need to be thinking about, what does eviction prevention look like in that context? And again, this is deeply linked to rates of social assistance and other forms of income assistance, including for folks with disabilities. As all of you will know, these are not livable rates. And so combined, I think these are some steps we could take on the policy, within the policy sphere, that would move us towards advancing the right to housing for women and gender diverse folks. And we wanted to leave you with a few thoughts. Hold on a second. No. There we go. Of where you folks can go in terms of leveraging the right to housing legislation. The bottom line there being, fabulous you're here. Educate yourself on what the right to housing is. I love what Alex said in terms of, like, you folks are working alongside rights holders. Start thinking about your clients or the folks you serve as rights holders. And providing avenues for them to access the benefits of this legislation, including through the development of submitting a systemic claim. That's something that the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network is working on right now. So if you're interested in this area of advancing a systemic claim, please reach out to us. And I'll leave the last word to you, Alex, to point where folks can go next with their practice.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much. And so we just wanted to outline some questions that you can ask yourself about your social work practice. And I wanted to just leave you with some thoughts. You can answer these in the chat if that sounds good, if there's something that really sparks your interest or gets your brain flowing. And so I'll just leave a couple specific ones with you. Are there violations of the right to housing for women and gender diverse people occurring within your context that you can see throughout your work? Are the services that you provide or are involved with safe and affirming for women? How about for gender diverse people? What power do community members' opinions or voices have in organizational decision-making, policy decision-making? Are you listening to diverse voices? Are you and your organization using a GBA plus lens? And how best can you support the communities you serve to claim their right to housing? So you can take some time to think about that. But also I want to leave you with the thought that beyond working directly with communities impacted by homelessness, an understanding of gender and justice should also be part of how you shoulder up other social workers and your colleagues throughout your practice. This applies to everybody. It's relevant no matter what type of work you do. And so thank you so much for sharing this time with us. We're really excited to have a couple minutes to answer your questions. And this has been really great.
Wonderful. I think I was doing I was almost on mute and talking. So just a huge thank you. But everyone can hear me, right?
We can hear you.
Okay. Woo! Okay, so wow, what a wonderful presentation. Thank you both so much. I am always so happy to talk about the systemic reforms and needs that this country needs to make. And I know that social workers that do this work on the ground all day with folks, many of whom are on this call, really care about the conversations that we're having at a national level. So thank you for outlining that so well, both of you. I am going to jump right in because we're a little bit, we are getting towards the end of our time here today. And we do have some really wonderful questions in the chat. So feel free to put your questions in the chat or the Q&A and we'll try and get to them. Now, Caitlin, you had kind of just said this at the very last bit of this presentation. Rebecca asks, how do you claim the right to housing? The first slide of this presentation was called Claiming the Right to Housing for Women and Gender Diverse People. So how do we do that?
Okay, Rebecca, love your question. We didn't go into this in great detail. So the previous presentation I did with Sahar details the legislation, but very briefly, the legislation has a human rights accountability mechanism. So groups and individuals can go to the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate and say that their right to housing is being violated, can put forward what's called a systemic claim. And the office is required to review that. And the office will look at these claims and then will review them and make recommendations to the government. Either she herself will, or she'll send them to a review panel of experts. And what is very cool and important about this is, if you're in the area of research or policy advocacy, we make recommendations all the time. But under this legislation, the Minister of Housing has to table a response in the House of Commons and the Senate within 120 days. And then there has to be debate on the issue. So when I say claim the right to housing, this is one kind of new mechanism we have in Canada that groups and individuals can use to do that. So that's what I was referring to there. There's a whole range of international mechanisms that folks can go through to claim their right to housing, but we do have this important new domestic pathway. Alex, you might have other stuff to mention.
Yeah, on one of the slides, we mention just a few of the processes that they're all designed to be accountability mechanisms for the minister. And it's really one of the things that we've been working on as the Women's Network, as the Right to Housing Network, is to really imagine what a systemic claim could look like and to be reaching into communities to support folks to bring forward these claims. And so we're really thinking about the ways that it can be very much like grassroots, community-based, bringing people in and supporting people to give testimony in a way that meets their needs, that feels comfortable for them. And so the reason that we think it's really important that we're having this conversation with you as social workers is because you are connected to communities. You're seeing the systemic issues that people are facing. And we really want to connect, people who are facing these issues with this very new, very exciting mechanism for actually addressing these issues. And so I would definitely recommend just taking a look at some of our resources, housingrights.ca, or also watching the webinar from last time in which my colleague Sahar, as Caitlin mentioned, goes into this in much greater detail.
Yeah, wow, wonderful. And yeah, so I did just link to that webinar in the chat. It's also in your handout widget. So I would highly recommend going into that and we really outlined how to claim the right to housing in that webinar. So feel free to pop on over there and check that out. And I do see that Sahar is actually joining us today. So it's so nice to see Sahar in the chat. Yeah, actually helping to answer some of these questions. But I did want to ask both of you because for the folks who might watch the recording, they might not see the chat. So are there national groups that are leading advocacy efforts around changing the National Housing Strategy program to better meet the needs of housing people or those experiencing homelessness? And are they working together to express a consistent voice, or are they working in isolation? We're trying to do advocacy out of Winnipeg, but want more effective to add capacity to a national group. So I just pose that to you all because I know that the housing folks tend to do work very closely. So take it away.
Awesome. Alex, do you want to jump in or I can jump in too?
Sure. Yeah. So one of the things, Sahar put a message in the chat. I believe I saw something about this. We are working to bring people together in collaboration to address these issues. We're working with folks all across, community engagement, government relations, to put the issues people are seeing and these gaps in funding into action. And so we are really excited about, the ways that bringing communities together is shaping up through this work. And it is something we're really mindful of is speaking past these silos and especially jurisdictional divides. So if you're doing that work in Winnipeg, it would be really great if you could reach out to us, send us an email, and we can connect you in with this process. And it's still really under development. But it would be great to have the more folks possible involved.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. And yeah, great question, Kirsten. Yeah, tons of silos often, but I think in this case, there is a lot of collaboration and consensus around gaps in the national housing strategy, across a whole range of sectors and services. So I would suggest look out for the National Right to Housing Network. The Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network are working on this. There's a range of folks like Center for Equality, Rights and Accommodation that are doing great work in this area. The Shift is doing work in this area as well. And I think we're all pulling in the same direction, but certainly reach out to both of our networks because we'd be interested in supporting your capacity and collaborating.
Awesome. Yeah. I also wanted to give a plug. I did see something in the chat where some folks were asking about the financialization of housing and what we mean when we say that. And so I would highly recommend, obviously, there's lots you can find at both of Caitlin and Alex's networks. There's also a documentary called Push the Film you might want to check out that really highlights how housing has become a commodity versus the basic constitutional right that it is. So I would just recommend kind of plugging around and exploring the ideas and the concepts around housing. I don't know if either of you have anything to say about that.
Yeah, just that this is the horizon for political advocacy, I think. Right now, we desperately need to be tackling financialization, and the measures we've done so far are very limited, but there is a national conversation about financialization for the first time. And so I think there is a serious window of opportunity for us to be organizing on these issues. And yeah, so please educate yourself on what financialization is, how it's impacting the folks you serve, and what kind of solidarity work might look like to address it.
I would just add quickly to that. My colleague Sahar has done some amazing speaking and advocacy on the feminist implications of the financialization of housing. So I don't know if we can plug those things in the chat or if they're already plugged, but she's spoken so beautifully on it. I would just really recommend checking out those resources because Sahar is also incredible.
Yeah, so I just, for folks wondering what they can do, more additional resources, again, I'm just going to push you towards that handout widget. There's a lot of the writing that these folks have done. There's also just, the websites and whatnot, so you can really pop in there and check it out. Caitlin has generously provided her email as well in her speaker bio. So I just recommend getting involved and getting engaged. The other day, I got a notification from the National Right to Housing Network on a webinar, I believe, on the National Housing Advocate. So, sign up for these things. I don't know if either of you have any thoughts about the housing advocate before we wrap up, but I kind of wanted to ask as maybe a final note in terms of maybe you can give a little bit of a brief explainer as to what the National Housing Advocate is, and maybe just a couple quick thoughts before we wrap up.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a new federal housing advocate who was just appointed. She is very central in this legislation. She is the key person who is going to hold the federal government accountable for progressively realizing the right to housing, for aligning their work with the right to housing. So when you submit a systemic claim, when you are articulating these kind of systemic housing rights violations, she is going to be supposed to be a champion for affected communities across Canada. So check out her website, look at opportunities to submit claims, and also educate your clients or the folks you work with on how they can submit claims. Your organization can submit a claim. It's actually very easy. You could do it over the phone. It's not, they're very open in terms of the kind of claims that they're accepting. And it does require a response. So she will be a tremendous ally, I think, as we try to move towards a more just housing system in Canada.
Wonderful. Okay. With all that, I am going to wrap up. What a wonderful hour getting to spend and talk about housing strategy and housing policy. Thank you so much, Caitlin. Thank you so much, Alex. It's been such a pleasure. For all you folks wondering about the recording, you'll be able to log back on this link about, I would say, an hour after we conclude here today, and it'll be available on demand for you. You can share it with your peers, share it with your colleagues, log on, rewatch, log on, download your certificate or any handouts, all through the same links that you used today. So just thank you for coming. Thank you for sharing another hour with us. I so appreciate your insights. Any final words before we log off?
Just thank you for being here. Thanks for the work you do. I know social workers are totally overwhelmed and tapped out right now. It's been, a tremendously difficult time in the midst of COVID, but just sending you so much solidarity and care for the work you do, and looking forward to collaborating.
Okay. With all that, I'm going to wrap up. Thank you so much, all. We'll see you next time.